Welcome to Orlando, Florida. I'm Gordon Tomaselli, and we're here at the American Heart Association Scientific Sessions. And I'm speaking today with Dr. Frederick Masudi and Dr. John Piccini, talking about the clinical trial session, Cutting Technologies in Electrophysiology. So I wonder whether or not you guys could provide me your impressions of the session that you just attended.
Absolutely. So I thought it was a great session. I thought there was a lot of interesting data, both data from existing clinical practice as well as new interventions that haven't made it into clinical practice yet.
So there was some information about cardiac resynchronization therapy. Can you tell us a little bit about what you heard in that regard?
Sure. In a very interesting study from Case Western Reserve, Dr. Sunderman colleagues had actually over 15,000 patients who were treated with CRTD therapy, and the investigators analyzed the impact of both bundle branch morphology and very wide Q restorations greater than 180 milliseconds. And what they saw largely fits with much of the data we know that patients with right bundle branch block had worse outcomes, but in particular it looked like the patients with very wide Q restorations and right bundle branch block had the worst outcomes. So further adding to the evidence base that CRT may not be as effective in patients with right bundle branch block. And furthermore, we need other interventions for those patients, whether that be vagal stimulation or multi-site RV pacing for patients with right bundle branch block.
Yeah, so good therapy with people with left-sided delay, but not with right-sided delay, it looks like.
Absolutely.
And Fred, there was a talk about using a decision support tool for end-of-life care. Could you give me a little synopsis of what happened?
Sure. This is a very interesting, small, non-blinded study of a decision aid, specifically a video decision aid in patients with quite advanced heart failure, and assessing the extent to which this decision aid, as opposed to just a script, which contained all the information in the video aid, but was just a written script, contributed to changes in patient decision-making. And it seemed like these patients, who were all quite advanced with respect to their heart failure, many in class 3 and 4 symptoms who've had multiple hospitalizations, that it seemed that after exposure to this video decision support aid, there were more patients who thought they would forego aggressive care, which was concordant with the physician's assessment of what they thought was best for the patient. Admittedly, what the physician thinks is really not the fundamental issue. It's always what the patient thinks. But it did seem to result in changes in decisions about what patients wanted for their care.
Yeah. So involving patients more in all decisions, we think is
critically in finding ways to present information to them in a way that's understandable and help facilitate decisions they might make about their care.
Yeah. And the last two studies were technology, new technology in electrophysiology. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the Watchman and what we saw today.
So it was a great study out of Europe. More than 1,000 patients who had been treated with Watchman left atrial appendage occlusion device, which is just starting to be used in the United States now as a basis of FDA approval. But these are the short-term results looking at procedural safety and success in this cohort of about 1,000 patients in about 47 centers. And what they found was that the rates of procedural success were actually exceeded 95%, and rates of complications were in the 2 to 3% range, both of which were better than what was reported in the randomized controlled trials, PROTECT and PREVAIL, of the Watchman device. So interesting data about rates of complications and procedural success in real-world setting. There are a couple of additional studies that are starting in the United States now, 2 registry studies as part of the FDA approval with the Watchman device, which will also provide very important information about issues around safety and patient selection and outcomes for patients who undergo a left atrial occlusion with the Watchman device.
And these were comparably ill patients who were in the registry compared to the
interestingly,
RCTs.
if you compared it with the RCTs, the patients in this registry had higher estimated risks of both bleeding and stroke. And in fact, almost 2/3 of them were not even considered eligible for anticoagulation, which contrasts with the clinical trials populations in PREVAIL and PROTECT, where all the patients were essentially considered appropriate for anticoagulation. So it provides us a real-world perspective on both patient selection and some of the outcomes that we see with the deployment of technologies in a real-world setting.
So by at least some measures, at least as sick.
Yeah.
Good. And the last one was this mini leadless pacemaker. Maybe you could talk a little bit about Micra, John.
That's right. Very exciting development for practicing electrophysiologists. The pivotal phase 3 transcatheter Micra pacemaker which was several hundred patients. And what they did was they compared the performance of the Micra transcatheter pacemaker that can be implanted through a femoral approach, single access site, to historic control. And the results were very interesting. The study met both the primary safety objective and the primary efficacy objective, so acceptable pacing thresholds as well as a complication rate. The major complication rate over 30 days was 4%, and it appeared to be about 50% smaller than the complication rate observed with traditional devices that incorporate leads and a subclavicular approach. So very exciting. Of course, with all new technologies, we're going to have challenges with patient selection and rolling the therapy out in the real world. And one of the issues that's going to come up is we're kind of going back to the future with single chamber pacing, and a significant number of the patients in the study did not have atrial fibrillation, and yet there was an extremely low incidence of pacemaker syndrome, but something we'll need to work on as we roll the therapy out, if and when it should be approved.
And what's the predicted longevity of these really small devices that presumably have tiny batteries and little capacitors and all the other goodies?
Yeah, interestingly, not very different from traditional devices, and perhaps in some cases a little bit better, because the average thresholds were 0.64 volts with a impulse duration of 0.24 milliseconds. So because the pacemaker is more efficient and the electrode contact appears to be a little bit better, there's actually some battery savings.
I also understand that some of them have a piezoelectric in there, so they can actually garner or get some energy from movement, actually, that can recharge their battery. I don't think the Micra's one, but there's other technology on the horizon that will actually recoup some of the energy from motion that it creates. So interesting. So any final thoughts about this cutting-edge EP session today from either of you?
Well, I'd say there are a lot of very interesting new technologies, and there are a variety of different stages. The Micra at the stage of the randomized controlled trial, and the left atrial appendage occlusion device that's now being deployed into practice. And these are all very important building blocks to understanding that we're delivering technology to the right patients at the right time and doing it safely.
John?
Yeah, I'd echo those comments. I mean, sometimes it seems we have a couple clinical trials that come out and they're all negative results, and it's a little disappointing. But I think both the real-world experience with the Watchman, the Micra, and other technologies appear that we have a few winners with very good safety and efficacy.
So again, some exciting news here from Orlando at American Heart Association Scientific Sessions. Thank you for joining us.